You're now plugged in to the Delphi podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Tommy, and today I have on Jason from Story Protocol. Jason, what's going on?
Hey, Tommy. Thanks for having me. Yeah, just got back from a few weeks in Korea, so excited to be back in the day.
Was it vacation or was it business?
Korea Blockchain Week, but
Okay.
it was fun.
All right.
It was fun. Good food.
That's good. You don't look jet lagged. You look ready to go. So,
Oh, I mean, I'm back on it, back on the grind.
So Jason, I was prepping for this podcast and I keep seeing this news article, Story raises $140 million. And honestly, it feels scary to me. Like, how do you spend that? How do you look at it? How do you allocate that? I mean, walk me through that, man. That was a incredible situation.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, we're very lucky to have the support of Chris Dixon over at A16Z and Polychain, Hash, a lot of other really strong investors. So that 140 million number is it's the lifetime raise. So it wasn't just the Series B, but it was the seed, the Series A, Series B, everything combined. And so that's that number that you're looking at. And in terms of why we raise that number and what we're trying to do, it's really because we have a super long-term vision. We're basically trying to build out an entirely new way of thinking about law. So a lot of blockchains focus on finance, and I think that's what got us all into the space, is seeing how Bitcoin could be digital gold, how stable coins are instant payments, and how they're solving real problems in the world of money. But to be completely transparent, like the average person is not spending 5 hours a day watching their Charles Schwab account go up and down or their Bank of America account go up and down. Like most people, they spend 5 hours a day on TikTok, on Netflix, consuming content. And so what we're trying to do is really re-engineer blockchains to be focused on content in media and intellectual property. And there's a lot of, technical go-to-market ecosystem challenges we need to face. And as you know, this industry is insane. And so just to be able to survive for a very long time is what we're trying to do. But of course, like we're not in a rush to spend that capital. But we are trying to get the best talent in the world. And there's a very, very, few people that can do what we need. So yeah, I think it is really important to be able to have that long-term vision and not be worried just about like next week.
I feel a little targeted. I'm definitely someone who has Schwab open most of the day. But I feel like I might not be your target market. But, walk me through the thesis, right? And I'd be curious if it's changed, right? Story Protocol is trying to be the world's IP blockchain. So programmable IP, powering the next generation of AI, DeFi, consumer applications. It's not a thesis people, I think, have heard before. It's definitely not something that I think that I've ever seen. So I'm curious, like, why this is the focus, why you got interested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do think it's quite a different tone and different terminology. And as you said, different narrative than what a lot of people are talking about, right? It's not really restaking. It's not really DeFi. It's not about a lot of the things that people in crypto care about, which is not to say that those things don't matter, but that we're trying to do something completely new. In terms of how I got into it, I mean, I've been in blockchain for a while. I was in ICOs in 2017. I was mining Dogecoin back in high school. And that was my superficial interaction with tokens was, I played a lot of video games growing up as a kid, and they say blockchains, it's very good for unlocking access to the monetary system for people who are disenfranchised. And people usually think about, certain people in Argentina or governments that don't have good monetary policy. But growing up, like I had no access to the financial system because my parents wouldn't let me buy video games. So that's how I got into crypto. It was very pragmatic, problem I had of like, how do I actually, buy in-game assets, things like that. But I didn't really get seriously into blockchain from a technical perspective until around 2020, 21. And I was at DeepMind at the time. So I was, one of the first PMs at DeepMind focusing on productionizing their reinforcement learning models. AlphaGo, AlphaZero, these guys were playing chess, beating the world's best chess players, being the world's best Go players, StarCraft, what have you. But that's just research. And my role there was to bring it into production. So I've always been obsessed with, hey, this new technology, it's extremely exciting, but we have no idea how to make it useful. And when I saw blockchains, it was exactly that, but it was like 3 or 4 decades earlier than AI, because AI has been around since the 60s. So for me, the opportunity was this new technology is extremely fascinating. Everyone's talking about how it's going to revolutionize money, but no one is talking about how it's going to revolutionize what people actually spend their time doing. And so I thought, is there a way to actually build an infrastructure for intellectual property, for content, for media? Or are blockchains just limited to money? So that's kind of what got me excited. And then also when I was at DeepMind, one of the things that I saw was that, we had ChatGPT or like these large language models internally. before it was ever released to the public. So it was very exciting to be able to see into the future. And that wasn't just seeing into the opportunities that LLMs would unlock that we're starting to see now, like with Cursor and Copilot, but also the problems. And one of the big problems that really no one had any answer to, and still to this day, no one has answer to, is how do you actually sustainably train on the entire web? Because if you're using all these artists' information, all their data, all their IP, and not compensating them, I mean, I think we understand in the space that incentives drive everything, right? So if you have no incentive to create because someone else can just summarize or copy your style and use AI to scale it, that's a big problem. And we still don't have a good legal framework for that. And our thesis is at Story, it's like, it's not pen and paper. We're not going to go to the Supreme Court and they're going to fix everything. We need a software-based IP system that can actually keep up with social media, that can keep up with AI. And so that's really why I think blockchains can actually scale law and not just money.
I really like that analogy. I mean, one question though before we move forward is you're sort of at one of the best situations someone could be in, right? Google DeepMind on the precipice of like the largest, I guess in hindsight, AI movement ever, right? They have so much hardware, great talent, but you still decided to leave, right? Was there something there that you saw that you're just like, look, there's just no future for me here? Or was the story thesis that you're working on just that much of a pull factor to get you out of there?
Yeah, it's a really funny question because it was a mix of both. So the fun, or I mean, probably stupid thing that everyone thought it was really stupid when I left because I actually didn't have an idea that was super concrete. I knew I wanted to build blockchains, and I was very inspired by Mirror and now what Paragraph is doing. I was really looking at that area of the world, but I didn't have this like fully fledged white paper for Story in mind. So I actually quit without a real concrete idea. I hadn't met my co-founder SY. I basically just did nothing other than hack around on ideas for 3 or 4 months. So it wasn't like I had this amazing, investment. I was ready to go. It was very much just a leap of faith. But the reason why I made that is number one, there were push factors, but also more importantly, pull factors, and they're related, which is that I still find AI extremely fascinating. Like a lot of my close friends are at DeepMind, they're still working in AI. In fact, the majority of my friends are still building in AI. So I still think it's going to absolutely turn over the way that the current internet works. But at the same time, I felt like a very, very small cog in the machine. There's only 5 or 6 companies in the world that have the economies of scale, compute, and data and capital to be able to do AI research. And if I quit DeepMind, I was sure that some other smart person was just going to fill in my role and things would continue to blow up. And lo and behold, they have, right? So there was it just felt
It's
like
sad
I
to think
was.
about, but you're
Yeah,
right.
it's pretty sad, right? I was on this
Yeah.
train. This train is like the best train in the world, is the fastest train in the world, but I was just a passenger. And I've always been inspired by entrepreneurs and I've always wanted to build something. So for me, I felt like the counterfactual is like, yeah, I'm on this rocket ship of AI, but it's really not compelling for me. And like I said, I'm really interested in what's new and what's at the very frontier and bleeding edge of the possible. And so blockchains, it was exciting to me because no one had really figured them out. Like I think Bitcoin and stablecoins are the only like certain PMF products in the space. But outside of that, no one's really figured it out. And still to this day, I feel like that's the case. And that's really exciting because it feels like there's a lot of room for ambitious, purpose driven, smart people to be able to make a dent in the universe that way. And so that's what excited me, is kind of the open endedness of it all. So, yeah, it is kind of a little weird. It's kind of counter cyclical. But for me, it's like if people are making fun of something, if people think it's a scam, if people brush it aside, that's the opportunity, is to prove people wrong. And that's where your agency goes much further. So that's why I'm excited about building in the space. Well, one of the reasons, of course.
Yeah, it's cool too. You bring it up because like just today, Jensen released their decentralized trading paper, and you just mentioned there's like 4 or 5 teams in the world like Meta, Google, OpenAI that could train these models, and sort of that has even started to shift, right? With
Mm-hmm,
like
mm-hmm.
News Research, with Prime Intellect, with Jensen, like even that is trying to starting to move into a different world of acceptance.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Jason, going on to story, given that people haven't seen this before, I'd love to walk through just maybe a basic example we could build off of, right? Like we don't have story and we have story. We have this valuable IP. Like how does it work in the story situation and how does it work in the real world?
Yeah, so I think a good example is to actually build off of what people in crypto are familiar with, which is like PFPs, right? That was kind of, I think, the first baby steps, and I'm in no way trying to trivialize it. I think what Azuki and Pudgy, and I'm friends with Zagabond and Luca. I think what they've done is incredible, but it also goes to show how much further we have to go. And so I'll give you an example. Is like, let's say I have an Azuki PFP, you have a Pudgy. I don't know who you are. I just found it. I just saw your Twitter, right? And now I want to create a comic or some sort of, story, whatever it may be, whatever medium it may take, but I want to use your IP. Let's just say it's a comic. So how would I do that today without story? Well, first I would have to understand what my license entails. I had to go read, the Zuki license, which is not necessarily easy to read. They have simplified it a little bit, but then I have to also go read your Pudgy license, and I have to understand that. And then I need to get in contact with you, right? I need to find out how can I get permission to use your IP. And then we probably both need lawyers, because to make sure that we're not getting screwed over, like we need to have some sort of legal agreement that I agree to license your IP, I pay you this or that much, and then great. So now we both need lawyers. I need to somehow get in contact with you. And then once we have this deal signed, like one of us has to develop the IP and trust that the other person is going to pay them, right? So there's a ton of friction involved. And it's basically the moment you want to do anything with IP, you get pushed back out to the traditional legal system. So the analogy I like to make is like, imagine if you're trying to make a deck swap and you have to go get a broker, right? And then you have to find a counterparty somehow. And then that counterparty needs to have some representation as well, and then you can execute the trade. Well, at that point, there's not much fun or function in using something like Uniswap, right? So this idea that IP is composable hasn't been realized in the same way that DeFi has created composable money Legos, because you actually truly can take a Uniswap token, swap it on Uniswap, put it into Compound or Aave, and it can just have this entire composability across this ecosystem of DeFi applications. IP, the moment you want to compose it with anyone else's IP on any other app, you're shot back into this expensive, opaque pen and paper world. So with Story, that process looks completely different. I can look at all the IPs on Story. Maybe one of them is your Pudgy. I can instantly see, who you are. I can see how much you want me to pay to use that IP, what circumstances I can and can't use that IP in, and also if I earn revenue from using your asset, how much do I have to share with you. All those terms are on-chain, human and machine readable. And if I click a button, I agree with those terms, I click a button, I have not only a licensed token on-chain, but also a real legally binding contract with you. And I didn't have to talk to you, you didn't have to talk to me, and now I can create this comic, and if I earn revenue, it's streamed back to you instantly. So now you have true composability on chain for IP. So you have IP Legos in the same way that DeFi built money Legos, and now you can imagine a future where every single piece of content you see on TikTok or on Netflix has like a little blue check mark at the corner, and that blue check mark is to say that, hey, this is programmable IP, this is registered on Story, and you can actually take it off this app where you're seeing it and bring it to any other app and use it as long as you meet those terms. So that's really the vision we're building towards. It's when the content you see, exactly who made it, how much you need to pay to use it, and also it's not just you as a user or creator, but also as a developer. You have an API that allows you to read and write around each intellectual property. So that's really what we're building towards, is to reduce the friction around making use of content and monetizing that content.
That's an awesome answer, Jason. How much do you think how much easier is it to use Story? Like, I know you mentioned the lawyers, the pen and paper, the contacting, even when you don't even have contact information
Right.
for something like a PFP. But like, seriously, like, what is it? Is it a day versus a year? Is it $1,000 versus $10,000? Like, what are the metrics that we can point to on the difference between using
Yeah.
Story and real world?
So I think for me, I would be pretty sad if all we did was replace existing lawyers, because actually in my mind,
Please no.
sorry to the lawyers out there, especially lawyers we work with, but
We love them. Yeah.
I think, the analogy I like to make often is YouTube, right? Like, and so one question you might have wanted to ask YouTube founders is, okay, so like, how much easier is this in Hollywood? But really what they were doing is they didn't go to Steven Spielberg and try to pitch Steven Spielberg like, hey, man, you don't have to like wait for people to go to the movies. You can, distribute to people on their phones. Like, this is super powerful. They didn't do that. They just got a bunch of random things like Annoying Orange, like Fred, like Niga Higa. They had some random stuff on YouTube. And most people thought it was crap. Like, there was a lot of like home videos on YouTube that were genuinely not that interesting. But point is, they targeted this like neglected class of creators, the people in their bedrooms that had no chance of ever being seen by Hollywood. And then over the decades, that evolves into Mr. Beast, where now every Hollywood creator wishes they could make as much as Mr. Beast, wishes they could own their community like Mr. Beast. And so I don't think we're going to go and replace like Disney's legal team. I don't think Disney's going to be the first user of Story. I think it's going to be the people who, just like YouTube sort of built off of the fact that everyone for the first time had an iPhone, a video camera in their pocket, and fast internet to upload and download videos. I think what we're betting on is that now we have generative AI. So everyone is a creator, right? It doesn't matter how good or bad you are at drawing or singing or whatever it is, you can create. And also now you can share your content through social media. So I think the right pieces are in place to unlock like 99.9% of the world that has no access to IP and would never even think of hiring a lawyer, much less be able to afford it. So it's really about, does IP get used or does it not? It's more of like a binary thing. But I can say that even like a very cheap lawyer or legal operation, like licensing is going to take, tens of thousands of dollars at least. So right now it's a system that really works for the big guys. And the big guys are the only ones that have access to IP, which is why people think about IP like it's some sort of defensive monopolistic thing, because right now only defensive monopolistic studios are using it. But I think it's like actually about growth. IP is about incentives, creating incentives for creators to continue creating, for their community to build on top of it. It's not about get off my lawn, don't use my stuff. It's about, here's how we can work together and create a win-win situation where you can extend my work and we can both get paid. So that vision of IP is just not possible today, because right now the only people who can afford to use IP are like people who want to squat on it and defend on it.
Jason, the YouTube versus Hollywood example is amazing. I haven't heard that one before. It just puts like different worlds into perspective, and how like the Hollywood era did not capture TikTok or YouTube or
Right.
Reels or anything like that. So let's keep going with this example, right? One of the things I'm not worried about, but want to dig into is like, let's take that CryptoPunk example, right? Honestly, I'm like not too interested in like an alien punk comic book, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking that that's like very a small part of what you're thinking on the creator side. Like, is there, like, walk me through it? Like, is it movies? Is it just comics? Is it reels? Like what is the creative juice you're kind of looking for here?
Yeah, well, our thesis, like our go-to-market has always been, we're building very general purpose architecture, and we're going to make big bets on consumer entrepreneurs that want to build entirely new types of consumer applications using that architecture. And the reason why I say that is because IP is very broad, right? So someone can be a podcast creator, someone can be, a screenwriter for Hollywood AAA film, someone can be someone who draws characters in their free time. And so it doesn't make sense for Story to say, hey, let's appeal to creators, because what does that mean, right? It could be a TikTok creator, it could be anyone. And so our thesis is, well, apps need to serve their users, and those users need to be served in their unique ways. And there's so many different types of IP creators. We should bet on an ecosystem of really, really powerful applications that then those applications own the relationships with the end users. So we're building general purpose, almost developer tooling. And then there's developers that are building really interesting applications that could not be made before on Story. And then those applications can compose with each other. So we often use analogy of an IP Legoland to describe what that means. And so I'll just give you a simple example using apps that we already have worked with and integrated with. So one of them, let's just like go through a journey. Like imagine there's 3 different apps, and I'll show you how like a single IP can just flow through those 3 apps permissionlessly, in the same way that like a unit token could flow through 3 DeFi protocols permissionlessly, right? So one app that we're currently working with is called Magma. They're a Web2 sort of app that has 2.5 million users, and they have this Figma, but it's for visual artists. So it's a Figma UI for visual artists. Think about like multiplayer Illustrator. So their integration with us is that anytime someone finishes creating art, they can register it on Story through the Magma interface permissionlessly. There's no wallet, there's no gas. All of it is seamless Web2 UI. And so imagine that artist 1 is just using Magma. They might not even know about Story, but because they've finished creating a character, that character is automatically registered on Story. And then the artist can at any point add terms to that character that describe how anyone else can license that character. So they might say, okay, well, I've created this character on Magma. I'm going to register it, and if someone pays me $5, they can use it. So now person two can be on an app that we're also integrated with called Mahojin. And Mahojin is an AI remixing app. So imagine on Mahojin, there's sort of like a search function where you can search for like an underlying image, and then you can add an AI prompt to remix that image and get like 8 different versions. So the moment person 1 registers their character via Magma on Story, that character pops up in Mahojin's search feed. And so now I'm like person 2. I've never met the first person on Magma. I don't even know who they are, but I really like their character. I mean, I want to use it. So I pay 5 USDC. I'm using AI to create 10 different versions of it. Maybe I'm adding different equipment or changing the background. I select one. That gets registered as a derivative on Story. So now you're building this decentralized IP graph. You have the original IP on Magma. The second person has now remixed that IP, and it's now a derivative on Mahojin. And the moment that derivative gets registered, it pops up on Sekai, which is a third app. So now you have a third person who's never met these other 2 people, and he's trying to create a webcomic on Sekai. And Sekai is basically an AI-powered webcomic creation tool. And one of the steps is you have to like pick what characters you want in your story. So you can either create your own characters or you can leverage other people's characters almost like a Roblox like way. So in that character search bar would be this like AI remix character from Mahojin, and they could literally create a comic around that. And Sekai has some sort of micropayment sort of gating so that people can monetize their comics. So imagine someone pays a micropayment on Sekai to access that comic that the third person created. Let's say that micropayment was 1 USDC. Like essentially you would be able to split that revenue through every single person, the Mahojin remixer, the Magma original creator, instantaneously, because we've built out this graph on the back end that is this content graph that underlies all of these different applications. And so in the same way that Farcaster and Lens have this social graph that any client can build on top of, we're building this underlying IP graph that keeps track of and helps monetize a single IP as it gets remixed and extended and grows and monetizes across many different applications via different people.
That is a great example. Just thinking through the flow. Um, and the story protocol is tracking, like that is the foundation of your network, is the tracking and approval or disapproval of all these IP rights.
Yeah, I would say it's like a full stack solution in terms of the tech stack. So the very base layer is a layer 1 that we've built that's optimized for IP. And then enshrined on top of that is a smart contract protocol that we're calling the proof of creativity protocol. And basically how the proof of creativity protocol works is that you have these smart contracts that store IP state. So it's like a big IP registry, like a repository. And then you have modules, like these functions that the IP has access to. So a royalty module, a licensing module, a dispute module. Every single IP can set the parameters for each of those modules so that anyone else can interact with that IP, almost like an API around that IP that defines its interface with the outside world. And then wrapped around both the layer 1 and the smart contracts, all the blockchain stuff, we've abstracted that away through an API. So when I gave the example of Magma, basically Magma is interacting with us like they would interact with Stripe. They don't even have to think about the Web3 part. So basically, it's kind of a choose your own adventure. We built this full stack solution. Smart contract developers can obviously integrate directly with smart contracts. But if you don't care for that, or if you're building on another chain or off chain, you can just use our APIs permissionlessly. So that's kind of the structure of what we build. Is I really believe that like using a blockchain service should not be that different from using a non-blockchain service, even not just from the user experience, but from the developer experience.
I'm with you. That makes sense. So I want to go back to your example for a second. Um, Thinking through like very viral, well-known content, it seems like the old model is you have some, let's take Marvel for example, right? They run with these superhero characters, they become mega famous, they're known everywhere, and then they, profit off that through movies and through collectibles and through shows and all these things that sort of they approve.
Mm-hmm.
My mental model for story is, I guess, the complete opposite, which is where somebody can create some cool IP, whether it's a character or anything, and then it's sort of like up to the community to really make this a big deal or a big thing in different ways, right? um is that like the right mental model? And I guess I'm curious to ask you, like, is it hard to make IP content valuable if um you have this cold start problem where you don't have like all the money in the world from a Disney or Marvel to push these characters?
Right. This is a really important question because it's, I think a lot of people they come and see story and they're like, okay, well, I don't really think that random people on the internet can create, the Game of Thrones, right? And I agree with that because if you're George R. R. Martin, I don't think Game of Thrones is better in a world where after every episode you go on Reddit and you're, canvassing your community, like, hey guys, like what should happen next? Who should die, right? Like that's going to lead to a very crappy outcome versus if you're, I mean, he takes his time for sure, but like if you're George R. R. Martin, you're a guy, sitting in a room and you're really thinking this through, that's probably going to lead to like really high quality content, right? So I'm not against the idea that there is expertise in the creative space. I would actually very much be in the camp of, people are better or worse at creating stories. But I do think it's about how do you actually make that core that can be developed by an expert as good as possible. And so right now, I would think about it like a tree. Like Disney is like basically building a tree with no branches. It's all Disney. It's whatever, Disney execs think is great. That's what they're building. And if the fans don't like it, then too bad, right? So it's a big tree trunk, right? And like obviously you need experts to build out the trunk to build out that base. But I don't think they're capturing the most value they could because really what's happening is they're building an antagonistic relationship with their fan base. So I've heard of literal examples of, friends of friends who are super big Harry Potter fans, for example, and they would be creating scarves on Etsy of like the different houses. And they wouldn't even be generating that much revenue, right? It was more like a fan thing. And the moment that Warner Brothers finds out about this, they actually sued this person for generating revenue off Harry Potter IP, which is fair. Like, it is a violation of the copyright. But then they turned a lifelong fan into someone who detested the franchise, right? And the value that that fan was creating in terms of fandom was much higher than whatever revenue they were taking away from Harry Potter, right? And so I think that antagonistic relationship where, when you have the current IP system, you have like a hammer of protection and everything looks like a nail, like you're just trying to take out everyone that possibly infringes on you. That's a very limiting belief, and it doesn't scale with the internet, because now you really can't, it's very hard to prevent people from remixing your IP, right? With social media, with AI. So I think the better model is, yeah, you can have an expert who creates really great content, but now you have an army of evangelists with skin in the game, right? You're actually allowing them to be able to get some of the rights and be able to monetize off of your work. And now you have 10,000 movie creators which are using Runway to create, remixes of your content. You have people creating music around your content using AI. Like, you can actually grow your IP much larger in this networked way than in the siloed way. And I think that's why every business wants to have network effects, because the more people join in, the more valuable it becomes. And right now, content has the opposite of network effects. It's like, you're basically in this Darwinian battle to the death with every other piece of content for attention. So the reason why Hollywood is going on strike is because every dollar they earn, 99 cents goes into advertising. So you don't have any network effects. You don't have economies of scale. You have the opposite. Like, every piece of content on Netflix is going to war against every other piece of content on Netflix. And so they just need to spend ever more revenue to grow it. Whereas if you have this model where you have a bottoms up IP, then the more fans you get, the more people are creating content, the more valuable the franchise grows. And it's actually like the sort of compounding effect. So that's kind of our vision, is networked IPs as opposed to siloed IPs, but there's certainly room for expertise and quality content there.
That's a great answer. And then maybe just a different question on like the next step in this process. Like, again, going back to the traditional Disneys and Netflixes and Hollywoods of the world, they have distribution platforms to monetize this IP, right? They can put out a movie, they can put out a song on Spotify or Sirius or whatever, right? They can earn money, flows back to the original creator, the lawyers, everyone in between, right? If I remix IP on Story, I really like a song, I really like a character, I make a movie, I make a song. My ability to, then monetize that is difficult, right? So I'm curious your thoughts. Is that not difficult, or is that less difficult
No, this problem
to
with
get that money?
distribution is really interesting, and it's one that we are actively digging into and thinking about every day. So my belief is that blockchains aren't really a distribution technology. Web 2 is all about distribution. It's a distribution innovation. So you have Snapchat, you have Instagram, you have Facebook. I mean, these are the canonical, or even Google is a form of distribution. So you have these canonical giants that really innovated on distribution. And that was what Web 2 contributed, right? It's a UX distribution technology. Blockchains are not. Like nothing about blockchains is a distribution channel. It's almost definitionally not. And so blockchains need to partner with distribution channels. They're complements and not substitutes. And so I think that's why I find on-chain social so exciting. That's why Stories partnered with Lens. We've made permissionless integrations with Farcaster. I talked just to Rodeo and their team over there. Like, I think that is really important to have. And also, the most exciting probably about all of them is Ton, right? And Telegram. So you finally have a crypto native distribution channel that allows you to complement Web 2 scale distribution with Web 3 level value capture mechanisms. That's really exciting. So we're thinking a lot about building or encouraging our ecosystem apps to leverage Telegram's distribution, because they can actually, embed crypto native primitives from Story in that. So I do think your point is very sound, which is like, at the end of the day, content as an atom with no one looking at it, no matter how good that content is. If I could have the Mona Lisa behind closed doors, but no one cares, right? So I think distribution is a key question. And that's another reason why we're so focused on developers, because we want to build even more crypto native applications that have their own distribution mechanisms, so that you have an ecosystem of consumer apps, each with their own distribution. And through Story's network effect, an IP register on one app instantly gets access to every other app and all their users. So that creates a flywheel where, if I'm a creator, I'm more likely to, want to use apps that registered on Story, because I know if I register on that app, or if I create on that app, it's not just that app where the surface area for monetization exists. It's every app that's integrated with Story. So if we can work with Telegram, if we can work with Farcaster, if we can work with Lens, and ideally with TikTok and Netflix, although I think their economics are kind of different and they wouldn't want to at first, at least, that's the ideal. So blockchain is a value capture coordination mechanism. It's not a distribution technology.
I mean, maybe not switching gears a little bit, but just talking about the traditional world. Like, what is the I don't know, the state of the art alternative in the traditional world that you're trying to convince people off of, right? It sounds like the old world is very pen and paper, very hard to work with, but like, how has reception been from these large, let's call them Web 2 traditional IP holders? Like, are you able to convince them, or is this strictly like a Web 3 crypto IP type focus?
Yeah. Well, I would say the funny thing is one interesting thing that I've noticed is that at least in the US, like crypto is really, really popular in LA and in New York, especially New York, but also LA but not in SF at all where I live. And so the question is why? Um, I think that big part of it is that LA and New York, Wall Street and Hollywood, they both have industries that are suffering big time, and it's very obvious how blockchain can help. Whereas SF, it's the AI industry, and that's going very, very well, and so no one really thinks about blockchain. But I think if you're living in an area or a city that's dominated by an industry that's struggling, if not dying, like Hollywood is, people are very receptive to blockchain because they see it as a completely new way to monetize when the current system of monetization is not working, and it's clearly not working because Hollywood is on strike for 6 months out of last year, and they're not really, there's no real innovation there. It's just, like I said, a competition to the death of a zero sum game. And so I think a lot of really, really top Hollywood creators are excited about this because for them it's an opportunity to break out of the studio where they're just getting paid a salary and actually own their fate, and become almost creative entrepreneurs that can go direct to their community and let their community build directly on their work, where they as a creator capture all the upside, and not a company or a studio that's paying them. So I actually think like a lot of top creators, we are working with some of them. I can't announce them right now, but like we are working with some pretty big Hollywood creators who are basically striking out on their own for the first time when they've been basically stifled by these studios for their entire career. And so they're gonna. It's like right now I would describe the creative environment as like Mark Zuckerberg getting paid by a studio to build Facebook and then capturing like 1% upside. Right? It's just completely different. And I think that we should move to a creative entrepreneurship model, which is why Hollywood creators are very excited about working with us. But I will say, like going back to the YouTube analogy, I still think at the end of the day, it's the people that need this the most, that have the least alternatives, that are going to be the most power users because they're going to be fully native. And so I do think it's going to be like the long tail of creators and not these mega creators that have already become incumbents in the current system that will be the true adopters. But to answer your question more specifically, I think there are interesting experiments with using software to sort of streamline the legal system and to protect IP and to grow it. I think Shutterstock and Getty Images are pretty good examples of how software can make IP more frictionless. But the limitations are pretty obvious, which is number one, it's limited to only a single medium, and number two, it's limited to only a single app. So unless you're on Getty, this doesn't work, right? And so you don't have this composability, and that composability is really what makes blockchains exciting. Like any single app can probably replicate the benefits of blockchain without using blockchain. But if you want this ecosystem, right? Like with DeFi, like you can definitely build an exchange without Uniswap. Like you have centralized exchanges, right? But they don't
Mm-hmm.
compose with each other. And Uniswap does. It's like the core entire ecosystem. So Getty Images is like a little outpost, right? But we want to build like this Legoland, not just a single ride. And so that's I think the difference.
It'd be cool if you could eventually tip the scales, right? Like convince like a center of gravity or mass of people in the real world to come to story. I mean, honestly, it's probably going to take a while, right?
It's gonna take a while. Yeah, it's gonna
Yeah.
take. But I've always thought like it's gonna come from like the final domino will come from someone like Epic, right? Like a massive company, the creators of Fortnite, that they're going against Apple, right? So there's like they're tiny compared to Apple, but they're massive, and if they can create a coalition that together is bigger than Apple, then they're gonna really want composability. So I think
Yeah.
something like that will need to happen where you have a big player but not the biggest, and they team up, they create a coalition, they use composable technologies, they build on story, and then together they're bigger than Apple, and then that, just like ChatGPT forced Google to innovate, I think that will force Apple to innovate.
Yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of examples. They're just hard to think of because it's so new. But I mean, one that comes to mind is just tracking IP flows for AI training data, right? Like Delphi
Yes.
Research as a data set, like tracking that would be awesome. The second one I'm thinking of is just people who mod games, create new game maps, new game modes, monetizing that and selling that somewhere. I feel like there's a lot of different ways, but to your point, it's hard to nail down what they will be because they're not out yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, you should be developing apps on Story because you named two of the most exciting, the key use case I'm most excited about. So we're number one, like our number one priority is this AI question, and we've actually partnered with a lot of apps who are basically trying to create economies around IP as training data because it's only going to be grow more valuable. Like your voice, your likeness, your style as an artist. That's like the entire internet's already been scraped, right? Like you can't take the fact that Wikipedia has been scraped and take it out of like llama, right? You can't take it out. It's already exists. But what hasn't been trained on is all this stuff on the edges, all this fine tuning information that's specific to creators, and that's where value is going to accrue because now that the common crawl has been commoditized. So I think we're really focused on allowing creators to own their IP and allow them to set the terms for how AI can extend it and monetize. And then yeah, I think the game mods thing is such a good example of why UGC, why composability allows you to become a massive industry. Because if you just do a case study of gaming versus music, gaming has become, as a market, it's actually much larger than every other single form of entertainment combined. Like if you combine box office, music, sports, any like broadcast, literally any entertainment category, you add it all up, it's still less than gaming. It's actually all less than mobile gaming. Mobile gaming alone is larger than all of those combined in their entirety. And the question is why? Well, obviously there's a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons is that the biggest games are all super composable. They're all platforms. It's all Roblox, Fortnite, Minecraft. And so I think that's an interesting vision where by being more open, they've actually captured more value. Whereas like music, it's actually shrunk in the technology and in this kind of streaming era. And it's because music is the most, if you like ask any lawyer, IP lawyer, like music is the worst in terms of how many terms there are, how many, how much fine print, how complex. So they've taken a very different approach, which is like, let's litigate everything. Let's like add rules and restrictions to everything. And as a result, they've gotten much slower and smaller compared to gaming, which is like, let's let people build stuff and let's see what happens. And now the biggest games are the most open, and gaming is, like probably 50x larger than music as a market. So I do think that's like kind of reflects the story thesis, and was one of the inspirations is like, how can we build a Roblox for IP? What would that even look like? That was kind of one of the questions we asked ourselves when we were starting the company.
Yeah, it's awesome to hear your like illustrative examples. I'm not our gaming expert. I have Jan and Piers on our side for that stuff, and Jeremy. But um, it is always interesting when people say like user generated content like doesn't really have a fit. And like I grew up playing like Halo mods on Forge and stuff. Like
Yeah,
it's just hard to realize. And I
I mean,
mean
League of
even
Legends was a mod at
yeah,
first
and
of
I
Dota.
mean
It was
TikTok
like,
and
or,
Reels.
yeah.
Walk me through TikTok on Story. What does TikTok on or Instagram Reels look like on Story? Like, do creators earn different flows of money? Like, is the audio IP protected? Like,
I think it's
how does
like,
that look?
imagine you're consuming a short reel, right? Whether it's on TikTok or YouTube Shorts, you like maybe there's a small information button or whatever. Like I don't know, I'm not a UI expert, but like let's just say you double tap on the video, or there's a small button, you press it, and out pops like an ingredients list, like a recipe or nutrition facts, right? Very human readable. Obviously, it doesn't have to be like as complex as nutrition facts, but let's say it's like, here's a song that's being used. Here's the, here's like the, dance that's being used, whatever it is, that's like the Lego blocks that are composing into this work, you can see. And you can also see like a graph essentially of how many people have remixed this, where they've remixed it. And so it almost looks like, if you've looked at like the Linux graph of like how Linux grew through open source contributions, you can just see this like sprawling organic graph. And there's also a button that allows you to remix it, and you can click that remix button and either remix on the app itself. So you can, like, this is kind of already built into TikTok and YouTube, this sort of duet feature, or you can remix on any other app that you'd like, right? Any app that's integrated with Story. In this hypothetical example, let's just assume most apps are. You can go and you can take the song and create a remix of it on SoundCloud. You can take the whole video and, like create a AI generated version of it that's making fun of it or whatever it is. And that can happen on the app or outside of it. So the kind of mental model shift here is that when you have this happen, the IP becomes the platform. The IP is the platform, and it's just using the apps to like, further grow itself. But the platform, you're not locked in anymore, right? Like you can, of course, you can still remix within the app, but you can also remix that IP anywhere else. And the original creator gets to monetize on that. It'd probably be micropayments, right? I think you're starting to see that pioneered by Rodeo, Zora, these types of apps. it's probably not going to be like $5,000 licensing deals. It's probably like, hey, pay 10 cents and go and, like use AI to remix this on some other app. And you can, as a creator, see where your IP is growing. You can see how derivatives have been made of your derivatives and see that grow over time. So that's the idea, is like you have this frictionless remixing ability, and you can see every single piece of content that was put into something.
I like that. I, I'm also worried about, or not worried, but interested in the edge cases, right? So like, let's say Uniswap has a mascot and it's some teddy bear or whatever it is. And I start Sushi Swap and I want to license and use the Uniswap logo to help drive, or mascot to drive users to my DEX. Obviously, Uniswap doesn't want that. Like, how do creators like put in rules and restrictions around like what people can do, and then two, like who's watching that and who's policing that?
Yeah, really powerful questions. I think they get at the heart of like what we're trying to do and what's possible and what's not. So the first question is, I think, a little bit simpler, which is basically how can creators approve or disapprove of certain use cases, especially in this permissionless environment. So the way that we've built this out is it's a very flexible architecture. So once you register an IP, you have all the rights. You can choose one of two high-level settings, essentially. The first setting is it's permissionless, which means you set your terms, and you're basically saying, hey, look, anyone who meets those terms economically, they can just use my work, right? You can obviously set content policies. You can say, hey, like no hate speech, no pornography, the basics. But basically, you're saying, look, if you meet these terms, you can go and mint a license permissionlessly via smart contract, right? So that's probably going to be more mimetic content, probably more casual content, more internet native content. And that's already happening today in the world of memes, right? So that's well established. But then you can also, as a creator, you can see incoming requests and approve them manually as well. That's a little bit more high friction. Like you'd have to go and check a portal that we're building. But obviously, if you're creating more high quality content, or if it's maybe like very niche and you want to have a lot of control over that, you can actually approve and decline or approve requests manually. So we give creators basically the option on how liquid and how permissionless their rights are. So that's kind of how we answer that. And then of course apps can build like specific logic on top that makes the user experience much easier for creators. But on the second question, that's really interesting, which is, okay, well, how do we know that people are actually obeying this, right? Like, let's say I'm a malicious actor and I just right click save as Mickey Mouse and I go register Mickey Mouse on story and I'm like pretending to be Disney, right? Like that can happen because we're building a permissionless protocol, right? So there's a couple ways we handle that. And so the first way is basically the backstop, right? This is like kind of like the worst case scenario, which is, okay, well, in the worst case scenario, like I'm pretending to be Disney. How does Disney defend itself? In that case, this is why we really, really emphasize this bridge between code and law. So every single IP on story comes back with a legal contract, right? So if someone doesn't pay you royalties, even though they said they would, because maybe there's some off-chain royalties, you have a legal contract with that person that literally states that they will pay you royalties, and you can go to court. So the worst case scenario on story is the best case scenario today, which is if you get screwed over, you have recourse to the existing legal system. Now, obviously, that's not very efficient. That's kind of what we're trying to avoid. But I do think that's an important call out, is like we're not just saying let's build software and naively expect that to be accepted in this traditional institutional world that's been developed for thousands of years. So that's number one. Number two is we built an on-chain dispute system that can plug into Claros, that can plug into UMA, that can plug into any other smart contract-based adjudication system, where people can flag IPs that they see. Anyone, whether they're the owner or not, can flag IPs that they see as in violation or infringing on other people's terms. And then there's a dispute process. And if that dispute process is successful, then that IP would not be able to generate revenue anymore. We'd pause all the payments to and from. And so we basically take them out of the system. So that's kind of like a software-based method that we find a lot more scalable, but we still think it's important to have that like ultimate legal backstop. And I guess like the last philosophical thing I'll say there is, I really think of story, like what inspires me about building it is this idea of building a true protocol for the internet. And so just like HTTPS, just like SMTP, just like the domain name system, that's kind of how I see story. Like I don't really see it as like a consumer facing product in and of itself. I see it as a protocol. And that's what excites me about blockchain. And if you study the history of protocols, like they're actually kind of dumb. So SMTP is like powering all of our email. It's simple mail transfer protocol. So every email client uses it. But SMTP itself does not know what content is being transmitted through its standard. It's just a dumb piping. It's just saying, hey, if you want to send email, structure it in this way, and we'll recognize it as email. But it doesn't know whether that's an email that's congratulating you on winning the lottery or whether it's an email that's a spam from like a Nigerian prince, right? It has no idea. And so when email got popular, one of the biggest problems was spam, because you could just send anything for free. Like, why not just spam it and try to fish a few people, right? And so that's a big problem that makes email unusable. So what happened is applications built spam filters and they competed on the quality of their spam filters. So Gmail created a spam filter, Yahoo created a spam filter, and they won and lost users on the basis of that user experience. So Story is a permissionless protocol. I feel very strongly about that, which means you're going to get a lot of crap. Like any permissionless protocol, you're going to get a lot of crap because it's permissionless, and that's part of the trade-off. But we're working with teams that are building, AI algorithms that can really easily detect the probability that something is infringing on something else. And you can plug that in almost like a hook. Before an app allows someone to register on Story, they can call that service and filter out a lot of the bad stuff. So building a protocol means also building an ecosystem. And just like SMTP wouldn't be usable without spam filters, Story wouldn't be usable without other solutions and teams building on top of our software. So I don't think we're trying to solve every problem ourselves. We're trying to build this neutral composable layer and then foster an ecosystem of solutions on top that make that layer much more usable and kind of improve the quality of life.
I like your three-part answer. You'll also figure this out as you go, right? Like you'll have
Yeah.
edge cases and improve. One of the questions, maybe to talk about a potential edge case, like, let's say you're a creator in California. You create this really cool IP. I want to use it. I'm in New Zealand and I want to use that
Uh-huh.
IP. I stop paying you for it. We have to use the court system and you to pursue me. Like, the global nature of Story is very interesting, but on the uh, persecution side of maintaining the IP and the value flows, is there any issue in having to use the court system for a global user base? Right, I feel like your number two answer, where it's like an on-chain dispute system, may be more viable in that world where people put up a
Yeah.
stake or a bond that can be
That's
slashed.
that's one reason why we much prefer to use crypto economic security and also crypto payment rails, because actually now it's just even easier to do licensing deals with people around the world, because you don't have to deal with Swift, you don't have to deal with KYC on both sides, you don't have to deal with vastly different levels of enforcement. You can just engage in this on-chain legal system, right? So that is one example, but I will say the internationalization is a difficulty, but it is a difficulty that's sort of ameliorated a little bit by the fact that international copyright laws are pretty standardized at this point. And the reason being that, this is a problem that people have had for hundreds of years. If I'm, Japanese company, Nintendo, and I created Pikachu, doesn't mean that someone in New Zealand or the US can just use Pikachu because it's, not Japanese, right? So there is broad international consensus on how to define copyright laws. Enforcement does differ. Like some countries are very uninterested in enforcing IP laws and others are much more interested. So this is just something that we'll need to work out as time goes on. But the actual letter of the law itself, like our license that we built, the programmable IP license, is pretty much accepted everywhere. In the same way that, if you create Pikachu in Japan, you shouldn't have to worry about whether people in America can use it for free.
Makes sense. um are you at all worried about having to like pursue all of these like issues, like edge cases with security, right? Because I'm just wondering, like, if people come to Story and they think, oh, I have this legal DAO behind me, right? They'll handle all the issues. Like, or maybe that is the point, right? Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we don't have like a legal DAO that would, like, we're not like Story, we don't want to be the arbiters of truth, right?
Mm.
Like, I think that's very much what we want to avoid. So it's not like I'm going to go and look at every dispute and I'm just going to decide based on how I'm feeling or whatever my principles are based on, whether someone's successful or not in a dispute. So very much so we want this to be a protocol, and we want to foster many dispute resolution methods that creators can choose between, almost like a marketplace for trust, right? So if you want to really high end, if you want to basically like have an oracle that's just spitting out the decision of like 5 legal experts and putting it on chain, that's fine. If you want an AI algorithm to be the disputer, that's also fine. Like, you have different levels of trust based on the type of IP that you're trying to build, how valuable it is, how much you care about it. And I think that's the right way to do things. It's almost like a marketplace for spam filters, right? Like, you can have a really expensive spam filter that, takes 5 hours before an email can go through. If you're the president of the United States, you might want something like that.
I
If
wouldn't mind
you
that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind having that.
I wouldn't mind not having emails for 5 hours, but
Yeah,
yeah, but so I think that's kind of our philosophy, but very much I think part of the opportunity behind what we're building and why hasn't been done and why we've raised so much and why we're on this long-term vision is because there's going to be a shit ton of problems that we don't foresee. And I think we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg. Even when we talk to lawyers, it's like this is kind of a very new concept, right? So it is scary, but it's also exciting, and I think if it weren't so complicated, it would have been solved by now. And so it kind of gives me a little bit of faith when I see that, because it means that, hey, like this is a tangle that is worth tackling versus this is the 15th version of something that people have already done. And I'm just adding a micro optimization on top.
makes sense.
So yeah,
One
it's
question I didn't
double-edged.
ask you was just on like the protection side. Like when people register their IP with Story, like are they getting are they going through the US like patent system and they're getting that sort of protection, or is it more just legal contractual protection through the protocol between the buyer
Yeah.
and the seller?
Well, one of the reasons why we're really focused on copyright and basically all of our legal infrastructure right now is designed for copyright is because the way that copyright works is very interesting. It's that you don't have to, you don't have to register copyright manually. So if I'm like in my room in the dark at 2 a.m. creating a stick figure that I think is special, like I have copyright around it instantly. So, but of course, if I don't register, it's very hard to prove that I was the one who did it in 2 a.m. in my room at this time, right? So what we're doing is we're leveraging the fact that any creative work already comes with copyright protection just by virtue of the law, but also really enhancing that by allowing you to actually have provenance for your work, and not just provenance but also set the terms for how others can use it. So we're kind of bootstrapping off of the copyright system, whereas for patents and trademarks you actually do have to go through this like complex approval process, right? So it's not just like, hey, I called an API on Story and now I have a patent. It's that's a little bit more high friction just by design, and so it's less of a focus for us compared to copyright, which is by design frictionless.
Makes sense. Jason, did we miss anything? I feel like we hit most of the story. Like any other questions people ask you or parts of the story you get excited about that I may have missed?
I think you hit basically all the core like questions, and also clarified a lot of what we're doing. I think at the end of the day, the most important, like I guess a few things, like I just reiterating, I truly see this as a new internet protocol, and I think there's been a certain framework that's been established, mental model around what a layer one blockchain looks like, and I think there's a lot of things to like about that model, but also a lot of things that don't make sense, at least for Story. For example, like we do have an ecosystem page now, but I think if we're successful in 5 years, we're actually less visible now than we are before. Like Stripe doesn't have an ecosystem page. Shopify doesn't have an ecosystem page. Imagine how ridiculous it would be to go on Shopify and see like a bunch of random stores that you don't even care about. If you go on Shopify.com, you want to create a Shopify store. You don't want to browse Shopify stores, right? Like there's nothing connecting them. They're just using the same
That's a good point.
backends. Or like Stripe. Like why would I don't care. Like I'm buying a hoodie. I don't want to see like the 5 other stores that are using Stripe, like where I had to buy watches or something. It's just so ridiculous to me. Like we're building a solution that powers applications. And while we're super early, of course, like it's good to feature some examples for developers to have an ecosystem page, but like I don't even like this idea that like you have to show an ecosystem and people have to play around every single app. Like it kind of feels like a local like resting point for the industry, not where we want to end up. So I just truly see this as like a neutral protocol that people can build solutions on top of that will have a lot of unanswered questions by virtue of its being a protocol, and that we'll have to work on together. So that's kind of like something I've been thinking about recently as we've been building for a while is like what mental models we have around blockchains that just like don't make that much sense in a success case. And then also, we're on public testnet, so anyone can build on us now. There's no need to, ask for permission to do anything. So, I just encourage anyone out there who's curious about, how does the Story actually work? Can I integrate my existing app with Story? Can I build a new app on Story? I think it should be really, really easy to do all three. And so, yeah, I think just playing around with the tech, and I'm always available to support ecosystem builders.
One thing I didn't ask you, which would probably be a whole podcast in itself, was just like the dynamics of your layer one blockchain, right? Like what would that look like? Like who are the actors and the stakeholders in that network? Like what is it built on? Maybe like that could be one like closing question and answer for you is just maybe just like what that's going to look like.
Yeah, so the like kind of the guts of our layer one, at a high level, it's EVM compatible on the execution layer. So we want to capture as many developers in the smart contract space as possible. And we think the EVM is by far the best solution for that. And then on the consensus layer, we are opting for faster finality and also a strong developer ecosystem on the consensus side. So that's why we use the Cosmos SDK. So this sort of best of both worlds approach, plus a lot of optimizations on top, tailored for IP, is what we're going after. And then, of course, we've enshrined our smart contract protocol on top of that L1. And to many developers, they don't need to know what the smart contracts are doing versus what the L1 is doing. They're just using a solution. But to smart contract devs, obviously, they need to know the guts. And so that's kind of the guts of what's happening. And then in terms of ecosystem builders, I think we are very pragmatic. And I think one of the coolest things about crypto is trading and exchange. And so I think a lot of the ecosystem builders are DeFi builders that actually want to access a new asset class. Because IP itself is it's a multi-trillion-dollar asset class that only people with legal teams can do anything with. So it's highly liquid, it's highly opaque, and IP is fun. People love meme coins, people love NFTs for this reason, because content is fun. And so we're actually working on some IP RWA projects with some very recognizable artists where they're going to tokenize their IP and bring it on chain. So that's not finalized, but that's one of the top priorities. Is the superpower of crypto that we already know about is exchange. And what we're doing is building the infrastructure to exchange, one of the world's largest asset classes that currently no one, not in TradFi, not in anywhere else, has access to. So that's kind of one portion of the ecosystem. And then the other portion I've talked about a lot with you, which is these creator tools, these AI apps, these more consumer facing applications. And I think, they're just different parts of the ecosystem, but parts of the ecosystem look very much like a DeFi oriented ecosystem, but with a new asset class. And then other parts are brand new consumer apps that, truly just don't look anything like a consumer app on any other crypto rails or on traditional rails. They're just brand new. So it's a mix of both. And so I think it'll be interesting to see the types of users and the types of community that pops up.
That's really cool, Jason. I'm really excited for you guys. I mean, it's a small part of your business probably, but it just seems like it also really unlocks or lowers the barrier to just monetize a company instead of having to go through an entire corporate M&A process, right? Just
100%.
monetizing your IP and everything in between. Just, that process could take months to years for a company, right? I mean, if you could list your IP on Story in a day, really changes the paradigm.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have people building apps where you can, use IP as collateral to get a loan, right? There's no reason why IP can't plug into all that. And this is what composability is so interesting. It's people have done amazing things with DeFi, and now we're plugging in a new asset class and it's just going to work. We don't have to create custom integrations for every single thing.
That's awesome. Jason, thank you for sharing the story thesis. It's been awesome watching you guys. I think I met you at ETH Denver last year and saw one of your amazing presentations, and just seeing everything you've done since then is just, crazy amount of progress. So really appreciate you coming.
No, appreciate the time to chat. And I think the last time we saw each other in person was very hot outside in Austin, maybe.
Maybe Austin. Okay. Yeah, it was on that conference circuit.
Yeah, exactly. No, but it's lovely to have this conversation. And thanks again for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Always.